Bushai was a food delivery boy. One night, after completing an order, he was returning home when he saw a woman standing by the roadside. She asked for a lift. Bushai thought, it's late at night, she might need help. So he let her sit on his bike and continued on his way. As he rode, something strange started happening. Every passing truck driver honked at him loudly and tried to get his attention. But Bushai couldn't understand why. Many people shouted at him, waving their hands, trying to stop him. But he ignored them, thinking it was nothing important. Then, suddenly, a truck driver blocked the road with his truck, got down, and picked up a heavy iron rod before rushing toward Bushai. Bushai's heart pounded as the man came closer. As soon as the truck driver touched Bushai's shoulder, an unbearable coldness spread through his body. His vision darkened. He collapsed. And the woman vanished. The truck driver quickly picked up Bushai and rushed him to the hospital. When Bushai regained consciousness, he was lying on a hospital bed, confused and terrified. He turned to the truck driver and asked, "What happened to me?" The truck driver hesitated, his face pale with fear. Then, in a trembling voice, he whispered, "That woman, she was eating your shoulder." Dear friends, we bring you real, terrifying, and fascinating stories. Sit back, relax, and enjoy these thrilling tales. But first, hit that subscribe button. Bushai pedaled his bike through the quiet moonlit streets of the small town. His stomach growled as the sweet aroma of the completed delivery order filled the air around him. The night was unusually calm, with only the occasional distant bark of a stray dog piercing the silence. As he approached a dimly lit intersection, he spotted a lone figure standing by the side of the road. A woman, dressed in a tattered dress, shivered in the cold night air. Her eyes met his, and she raised a hand in a timid wave. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice barely carrying over the sound of his bike's tires against the asphalt. "Could you spare a moment?" Bushai slowed down, feeling a tug of concern. It was late, and she looked lost or perhaps in trouble. He nodded and pulled over, the bike's engine sputtering to a halt. "What's wrong?" he asked, a hint of warmth in his voice. The woman's eyes searched his, looking for any sign of danger. After a brief pause, she spoke, "I need a ride, my car broke down, and I'm not from around here." Her words seemed to echo in the stillness of the night. He hesitated for a second, glancing at the food order in his basket, but ultimately decided to help. "Hop on," he said, gesturing to the back of his bike. "Where do you need to go?" As they rode, the woman remained silent, clutching a small bag tightly against her chest. The gentle hum of the bike's engine was the only sound between them, aside from the crickets chirping in the nearby bushes. The occasional car passed, their headlights briefly illuminating the woman's face, which was a mask of worry. The first honk came from a passing truck, jolting both of them. The driver leaned out of his window, gesticulating wildly. "What's his problem?" the woman muttered, her grip on the bag tightening. Bushai shrugged, assuming it was a drunken greeting or mistake. He waved back, not understanding the urgency in the man's eyes. As they continued, more honks and shouts followed, each one growing more insistent. The woman's discomfort grew palpable, her eyes darting from side to side. Suddenly, a truck pulled in front of them, its tires screeching. The driver jumped out, brandishing an iron rod. "Get away from her!" he yelled, his eyes wide with horror. Bushai felt a chill run down his spine, his confusion turning to fear. The man was coming for them, and there was something about the woman that made him think he needed to listen. He turned to tell her to run, but she was gone, vanished into the night without a trace. In that instant, he knew something wasn't right. And then the coldness hit, a pain so intense it brought him to his knees. His world went dark. When he came to, the sounds of the hospital surrounded him, beeping machines, the murmur of distant voices, and the antiseptic scent of disinfectant. His shoulder throbbed, a dull ache that seemed to pulse in time with his racing heart. He tried to sit up, but his body felt weak, his muscles unresponsive. The truck driver loomed over him, his eyes filled with a mix of terror and pity. "What happened?" he managed to croak out, his voice raw and strained. The driver swallowed hard before speaking. "You don't remember?" Bushy-Eyes shook his head, his vision swimming as he searched the man's face for answers. "The woman," the driver said, his voice low and trembling. "When I touched you, she was eating your shoulder." The words hit him like a punch to the gut, and bile rose in his throat. He couldn't believe it, couldn't understand what the driver was saying. His mind reeled, trying to piece together the events that led to this moment. The woman, the honks, the shouts, it all felt like a surreal nightmare. But the pain was real. He reached up to feel his shoulder, and his hand came away sticky with blood. A doctor and a nurse rushed in, pushing the truck driver aside. They talked quickly, their voices a blur, and then the nurse began to clean his wound. The pain was sharp and intense, but it brought with it a clarity that cut through the fog of shock. Bushy-Eye knew he had to get out of there, to escape whatever horror had found him on that lonely road. He tried to stand, but his legs gave way beneath him. The doctor assured him he was in no condition to leave, that he needed to rest and recover. But rest was the last thing on his mind. He had to find out what that woman was, and why everyone had been so desperate to save him from her. As the doctor stitched up his wound, the truck driver recounted his own encounter with the creature, his voice hushed and haunted. He spoke of her eyes, black as coal, and her teeth, sharp as shards of ice. He'd seen her before, he said, always at night, always feeding on the unsuspecting. She was a monster, a creature of the night, and she had to be stopped. The doctor finished his work, and the nurse handed him a cup of water, her eyes filled with a sadness that made him shiver. He knew he couldn't go back to his normal life, not after what he'd seen. He had to find out more, to warn others, or maybe even to fight back. As the night grew colder, and the hospital's lights grew dimmer, the resolve in his heart grew stronger. He would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. For now, he would rest, but soon he would seek out the woman in the tattered dress, and he would end the terror she brought to the quiet streets of his town. Bushy-Eye was released from the hospital the following evening, his shoulder heavily bandaged and his mind racing. He knew the woman couldn't be human, not with those black eyes and teeth of ice. His thoughts swirled with tales of mythical creatures that feasted on the flesh of the living, but none quite matched what he'd seen. The town was eerily silent when he stepped outside, the usual hustle and bustle of the evening replaced with a tense stillness. His bike was nowhere to be seen, but that was the least of his worries. The woman was out there, and he had to find her before she found someone else. He decided to start at the intersection where it had all begun, hoping to find some clue or pattern to her movements. His heart hammered in his chest as he retraced his steps, the chilly wind whispering through the trees above as if carrying the echoes of the night before. As he approached the spot, a chilling realization dawned on him. Everyone knew about her. The townsfolk avoided his gaze, whispering as he passed, their eyes filled with a mix of fear and pity. They knew what had happened, and they knew what he was about to do. The woman was a local legend, a creature that had been feasting on the unsuspecting for decades, passing from one town to the next, leaving a trail of horror in her wake. The truck drivers had recognized her, had seen her before, and had tried to save him from becoming her latest victim. Determined, he ventured deeper into the night, his eyes scanning every shadow for a glimpse of the woman. The streets grew darker, the buildings more dilapidated, and the whispers of the wind grew more sinister. And then, in the distance, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a bike engine. He followed the noise, his heart pounding in his ears, until he saw the flicker of headlights up ahead. As he approached, he saw her, sitting on the back of a different delivery bike, her eyes locked onto his. The rider was a young man, blissfully unaware of the monster clinging to his back. Without a moment's hesitation, she leaped off the bike and disappeared into the night. The man, startled, crashed to the ground, his bike skidding away from him. Bushy Eye sprinted toward the terrified rider, shouting a warning that was lost to the wind. But it was too late. The woman had vanished again, leaving only the echoes of her predatory laughter and the distant wail of the bike's engine fading into the night. He knew he had to be ready for the next encounter. He couldn't let her claim another victim. As he helped the shaken young man to his feet, he made a silent vow to stop the creature that had taken a piece of him. The town had to know, they had to be warned. But who would believe his story of a woman with teeth of ice and a hunger that could never be sated? Who would stand with him against the monster that walked their streets by night? The battle lines were drawn, and it was a war that would push him to the very edge of sanity. But he was not the same boy who had once delivered food with a smile and a wave. He was now a survivor, a hunter, and he would not rest until the nightmare was over. The town of Higashi was about to learn that even in the darkest hour, there is always a light that refuses to be extinguished. And in the heart of their most unlikely hero, a fire burned that no creature of the night could ever hope to quench. Dr. Mark's shoulders slumped with fatigue as he trudged up the stairs of his townhouse. The hallway was bathed in a soft, comforting light, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile corridors of the hospital he'd just left. He craved the sanctuary of his bed, yearned to sink into the embrace of his pillow, and let sleep wash over him. But as he reached the top step, the shrill sound of the doorbell pierced the quiet night. He sighed heavily, the interruption a knot in the peaceful fabric of his evening. With a reluctant shuffle, Mark padded downstairs, the wooden floorboards protesting under his feet. He peered through the peephole and found an old man, shivering in the cold, his eyes wide with desperation. His heart lurched at the sight of the frail figure. The man looked as if he had been out for hours, his clothes disheveled and face etched with lines of worry. "Please, doctor, come with me," the old man rasped, his voice a plea. "My little boy, he's not doing well, and all the hospitals are closed. It's the public holiday, you see." Mark hesitated, his mind racing. He was tired, yes, but he had taken an oath. Duty called, and he could not ignore it. He swung the door open and stepped aside to let the stranger in, his stethoscope a silent reminder of his commitment. The man's eyes searched his, hope flickering in their depths. "Where is he?" Mark asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. The old man's expression grew more urgent. "Come quickly," he said, his trembling hand reaching out to clutch Mark's arm. "My house is just a few blocks away." Together they ventured into the quiet night, the chill air a slap in the face after the warmth of Mark's home. The old man's house was indeed nearby, a modest, unassuming place nestled between two larger homes. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn tight. A sense of unease prickled at the back of Mark's neck as they approached, the porch creaking under their combined weight. Inside the house was eerily still. The old man led him through a narrow hallway, the walls lined with fading family portraits and the floorboards creaking with each step. They entered a small, sparse room that looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. There was no crib, no toys, no child. The only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, its rhythm echoing through the emptiness like a heartbeat in a deserted cavern. "Where is he?" Mark asked again, his voice louder this time. The old man's eyes searched the room, a wild, frantic look in them. "He was just here," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't understand. He was just here." The room was cold, colder than the rest of the house. Goosebumps rose on Mark's arms, and he could see the man's breath in the air. A feeling of dread grew in his chest, a heaviness that seemed to fill the very air around him. The child was nowhere to be seen. The bed was made, the sheets unrumpled, the toys neatly arranged on a shelf, untouched by little hands. The only evidence of life was a single, tiny sock, lying forgotten in the center of the floor. "Where's your son?" Mark asked, his voice strained. The old man's eyes darted around the room, as if searching for a ghost. His hand clutched at his chest, his breathing shallow. "I don't know," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I swear, he was just here." Mark's gaze fell upon the sock, and he bent to pick it up. It was damp, and as he held it to his nose, a faint scent of decay filled his nostrils. His heart sank. He knew what this meant. The old man was either lying or delusional, and the situation was far more serious than he had initially thought. The old man's eyes followed Mark's every movement, his desperation palpable. "Please," he begged, "you have to help me, he's all I have left." But Mark's mind was racing with 1,000 questions. Why bring him here on a false pretense? Why the empty room? And why the smell of death? The doctor's eyes narrowed as he took in the man's trembling form. His mind, sharp from years of medical training, began to piece together a grim puzzle. He turned to leave, his hand on the doorknob, the sock still clutched in his fist. "Thank you for your time," Mark said, his tone firm. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you." The man's face fell, his eyes brimming with tears. "You can't just leave me," he said, his voice rising. "You're the only one who can save it." But as Mark stepped out of the room, the shadows grew longer, the house groaning around them. The old man's hand shot out, grabbing Mark's wrist with surprising strength. His eyes gleamed with something other than sadness now, desperation, perhaps, or madness. "You will help me," the old man hissed. "You will, or you'll never leave this place." The grip tightened, and the cold of the man's skin seemed to seep into Mark's bones. The air grew colder still, and a sudden, inexplicable fear took hold of him. He realized then that he was not in a house of the living, but a house of the lost. And he had been invited in. With a surge of adrenaline, Mark wrenched his arm free and sprinted through the hallway, the old man's cries of, "You'll regret this," echoing after him. He burst through the front door and into the night, not bothering to look back. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled down the dark street, his legs unsteady beneath him. The quietness of the night was now a malevolent presence, the shadows hiding unseen threats. When he reached the safety of his own home, he slammed the door shut and leaned against it, his heart hammering in his chest. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had seen the fear in the old man's eyes. Fear, but not for his missing child. No, it was a fear of something much darker, something that had consumed the very essence of the house and its inhabitants. The silence of his own home felt suffocating, and he was suddenly aware of every creak and groan. His hand trembled as he reached for the phone, his thoughts racing. He needed to call someone, to tell them about the old man and the empty house. But who would believe him? Who could help him now? The phone slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor. As he bent to retrieve it, he heard it the faint sound of a child's cry, distant but clear. It was coming from outside, from the very direction of the house he'd just fled. His blood ran cold. Was it a trick of his mind, a manifestation of his fear, or was it real? He couldn't ignore it. The doctor in him, the man who had taken an oath to help those in need, would not let him. He took a deep breath and stepped back out into the night, the porch light casting a feeble glow into the darkness. The cry grew louder, and he knew he had to find the source. The street was empty, the houses dark and silent. The only light came from the flickering street lamps, casting eerie pockets of shadow. As he approached the old man's house, the cry grew more desperate, more urgent. He could see the windows now, the curtains fluttering in a breeze that did not touch the rest of the street. The house seemed to pulse with a malignant energy, and he could feel it tugging at him, willing him closer. The door was open, a gaping maw that swallowed the light from the street. He stepped inside, the warmth of his home a distant memory. The walls whispered secrets that chilled him to his core, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. The house was a tomb, and he had become its unwilling guest. The cry grew louder, guiding him up the stairs and down the hallway. He could feel the presence of something malevolent, something that watched and waited. And then he saw a flicker of movement at the end of the corridor, the shadow of a small figure. His heart leaped with hope and dread. The figure grew clearer as he approached, and his breath caught in his throat. It was a boy, no more than 7, dressed in tattered clothes, his eyes wide and frightened. But as Mark reached out to help, the child's form grew transparent, fading into the shadows. The cry grew louder, a wail of despair that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He was too late. The house had claimed another soul. And now, it had him in its sights. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet, the walls closing in, the air thick with the stench of decay. He knew that he would not leave this place unscathed. The old man's warning echoed in his mind. You will help me, or you'll never leave this place. And with a chilling finality, the door to the child's room slammed shut behind him, the lock clicking into place with a sound that was as final as a tomb. Mark's heart raced as he rushed towards the door, his hand trembling as he turned the knob. It was useless. The door was jammed. The room grew colder, the air thick with an unspeakable dread. The walls of the house seemed to pulse with an eerie rhythm, a heartbeat that grew louder with each passing second. The cry grew closer, the child's voice a chilling echo through the empty halls. Mark knew he had to find the source. The house was playing with him, taunting him with the promise of a soul in distress. But as he stumbled through the darkened rooms, the shadows grew restless, reaching out to caress him with icy fingers. In the corner of his eye, he saw movement, the flicker of a small figure darting from one shadow to the next. He pursued it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The cry grew more urgent, a symphony of fear and pain that seemed to fill the very air around him. The chase led him to the basement, the door creaking open to reveal a staircase that descended into blackness. The smell of damp earth and rotting wood filled his nostrils as he cautiously made his way down. At the bottom, the cry grew louder, a beacon in the darkness. There, in the center of the room, was a table. On it lay a tiny, lifeless form, the boy's body cold to the touch. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling, and his skin was pale and waxy. The sock he had found upstairs was clutched in one hand, a silent testament to his suffering. But it was not just the sight of the child that made Mark's blood run cold. The room was not empty. Figures lurked in the shadows, their eyes glowing with an unearthly light. They were the lost souls of children, trapped here by whatever dark force had claimed their home. They reached for him, their fingers like the cold grasp of death itself. Please, Mark whispered, his voice hoarse with terror. Let me go, I'm here to help. The shadows grew denser, coalescing into a form that stood over the table, blocking his way. It was the old man, but his features were twisted into a grotesque mockery of humanity. His eyes burned with a hunger that was not of this world. Help, the man cackled, his voice a guttural growl. You can never help them, Doctor. They are mine now, and you will join them. The air grew colder, the pressure in the room increasing, until Mark could barely breathe. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around his legs, his waist, his chest, pulling him closer to the table. The cry grew louder, a crescendo of despair that filled his ears. He fought with every ounce of strength he had, his eyes locked on the fading light from the stairs. It was his only escape, his only hope. With a roar of defiance, he broke free, stumbling back towards the stairs, the shadows clawing at his back. As he reached the top, the old man's hand shot out, grabbing his ankle. Mark kicked with all his might, the hand releasing him with a wet tearing sound. He scrambled away, his feet pounding up the stairs and through the house. The door was in sight, the warmth of the outside world beckoning. He threw himself against it, the wood giving way with a splintering crack. The night air was sweet relief, the stars shining down like the tears of angels. He staggered into the street, gasping for breath, his heart threatening to burst from his chest. But the cry of the lost child followed him, a haunting melody that played in his mind, a reminder of the horrors that lurked in the quiet, unassuming homes of this peaceful neighborhood. The house was still there, a silent sentinel of despair, the windows watching him with a knowing, malevolent gaze. Mark knew he had to warn the others, had to tell someone about the house and the creature that dwelled within. But he also knew that no one would believe him, not without proof. And the only way to get that proof was to go back. With a heavy heart and a newfound sense of determination, he turned and faced the house once more. The door swung open on its own, beckoning him into the abyss. He stepped back over the threshold, the air thick with malice. The shadows danced around him, the walls seeming to breathe in anticipation. The cry grew fainter as he moved through the house, but it was always there, a constant, taunting presence. He knew the old man was watching, waiting for him to make a mistake, to trip up, to become one of them. Upstairs, in the room that had once been a sanctuary for a lost child, Mark found a camera. It was old, the kind that used film, but it would have to do. He took a deep breath and made his way back down to the basement, the echo of his footsteps following him like a funeral procession. The table was still there, the body of the boy unchanged, the shadows of the lost children still reaching for him. But the old man was gone, his laughter now just an echo in the room. Mark took the camera in trembling hands and began to snap photos, the flash piercing the darkness like a beacon of hope. The shadows retreated with each flash, the cold air growing colder still. He knew he didn't have much time. The house didn't want its secrets exposed. The walls groaned, and the floorboards trembled as if trying to shake him loose. But Mark was not so easily deterred. He had seen the truth, and he would not let it be hidden. He took one final picture of the room before the camera was ripped from his grasp, the film snatched away by an unseen force. He turned to run, to flee the house of the damned, but the door was gone. The walls closed in around him, the shadows converging. He was trapped. And as the darkness enveloped him, he heard the old man's voice, now a chilling whisper in his ear. "You should not have come here, doctor. You should not have seen." The cold seeped into his bones, the screams of the lost children ringing in his ears. And as the last of the light was extinguished, Mark realized he had made a terrible mistake. He was no longer the doctor called to heal. He was just another lost soul in the house of the eternally unwell. The shadows grew thicker, swirling around him like a living fog, their icy tendrils reaching for his throat. He stumbled through the room, his hands sliding along the wall to find his way. The floor beneath him felt spongy and wet, the smell of decay growing stronger with each step. A faint glow grew in the distance, and Mark staggered towards it. It was the camera, lying on the floor, its film still intact. He picked it up with trembling hands, the light from the viewfinder the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. It was his only weapon, his only proof of the horror that lay within these walls. But as he turned to leave, the old man was there, his face a twisted mask of rage. "You cannot leave," he hissed, his breath a cold wind that sent shivers down Mark's spine. "You're part of the collection now." With a snarl, the old man lunged, his hands outstretched, the shadows at his back stretching and contorting into the shapes of the lost children, their cries now a cacophony of anger. Mark knew he had to fight, had to escape, but his legs felt like lead, his body heavy with dread. He raised the camera, the light from the viewfinder casting a feeble beam into the dark. The old man recoiled, his eyes squinting against the sudden brightness. The shadows retreated, giving Mark just enough space to run. He didn't look back, didn't dare to see if the creature was following him. He just ran up the stairs, through the house, the camera clutched to his chest like a talisman. As he reached the front door, the house seemed to come alive around him, the walls shaking with a malevolent rage. The door was a mere inch from his hand when the old man's voice boomed through the air. "You cannot leave with them." The camera was torn from his grasp, the shadows swarming around it, the light snuffed out like a candle in a storm. And as the darkness closed in, Mark felt the cold, unyielding grip of the old man's hand on his shoulder, pulling him back into the abyss. The house had won. The shadows swallowed Mark whole, the door slamming shut behind him with a finality that resonated through his bones. The old man's laughter grew distant, the shadows retreating to their corners as the house settled into a malignant calm. The only sound was the slow, deliberate tick of the grandfather clock, a mocking metronome to the silent symphony of horror that had unfolded. Mark felt a hand on his shoulder, but this time it was not the cold grip of the old man. It was small, warm, and trembling, the hand of the child he had failed to save. He turned to find the ghostly apparition of the boy standing beside him, his eyes filled with a sadness that washed over Mark like a wave of despair. "Why?" Mark whispered, his voice a broken plea. "What happened here?" The child's lips didn't move, but the words echoed in his mind, a silent scream that pierced the darkness. "He takes us one by one, the lost, the forgotten, the unwell. He offers them comfort, but it's a lie that turns their hearts cold and makes them part of the house." The realization struck Mark like a physical blow. The old man wasn't the victim, he was the monster, a creature that fed on the pain and suffering of innocence. The house was a prison, a tomb for the lost souls of children. The room grew colder, the air thick with the weight of unspoken secrets. Mark knew he had to find a way to leave, to break the cycle of despair that had claimed so many. He searched the room, his eyes falling on a bookshelf that had not been there before. The books were ancient, their pages yellowed with age, and a single tome stood out, the Ritual of the Unseen Physician. With trembling hands, Mark pulled the book from the shelf. The leather was cold, the pages sticky with an unidentifiable substance. As he opened it, the air around him grew colder still, the shadows seeming to coalesce into a living, breathing entity. The book contained incantations, spells that spoke of healing and protection. But scattered among them were darker rituals, ones that whispered of binding souls and bending reality. It was a grimoire of the damned, a guidebook for the lost. And Mark knew he had to use it to escape. The child's hand grew stronger, guiding him to a page that contained a spell to break the hold the house had on him. The words were archaic, the symbols twisted and alien, but Mark read them aloud, his voice echoing through the silent house. As he recited the incantation, the walls began to shake, the floor to buckle. The old man's laughter grew closer, a cacophony of anger and fear. The book grew hot in his hands, the pages fluttering with an unseen wind. The child's grip tightened, a silent plea to continue. The shadows grew restless, the air thick with a presence that was palpable, suffocating. But Mark didn't stop. He couldn't. He had to save himself, had to warn the world of the monster that lived in the house that no one talked about. The incantation reached its crescendo, the final word leaving his lips with a scream that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The darkness recoiled, the shadows retreating like a tide of despair. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the house was silent. The air grew warmer, the cold retreating. The door to the room swung open, revealing the stairs that led to the outside world. The child's hand slipped away, his form fading into the shadows. Mark knew he had to go, to leave this place before the old man returned. He stumbled up the stairs, the house seemingly holding its breath. As he reached the front door, the child's voice whispered in his mind one last time. "Remember, Doctor, tell them we're here." The door opened with a sigh, the night air a sweet embrace. Mark stepped out into the street, the camera still in his pocket, the proof of the horror he'd witnessed. The house stood behind him, a silent sentinel of dread, its windows staring at him like the empty sockets of the skull. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was alive, watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. With a final, determined look back at the house, Mark turned and walked away, the camera a cold weight in his pocket, the shadows seemingly retreating before him. The walk back to his own home felt like an eternity, the echoes of the child's cries and the old man's laughter following him like specters. The night had grown colder, the air thick with the scent of rain. The street lamps flickered, casting jittering shadows that danced along the sidewalk. Each step was a battle against the urge to look over his shoulder, to make sure the house wasn't pursuing him. When he finally reached the sanctuary of his townhouse, he stumbled through the door, slammed it shut, and leaned against it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The warmth of the living room was a stark contrast to the icy grip of fear that had taken hold of him. He knew he had to develop the film, had to show the world what lurked in the shadows of that house. With trembling hands, he fumbled with the camera, the film sticking to his cold, clammy fingers. The bathroom was the only place with enough light to safely remove it, so he retreated there, locking the door behind him. The sound of the lock clicking into place was a small comfort, a barrier between him and the malevolence he'd just escaped. Under the flickering glow of the bathroom light, he carefully extracted the film and placed it into the developing tank. The chemicals stunned his skin, a sharp reminder of reality amidst the horror he'd just endured. He waited, his heart pounding in his chest, for the images to reveal themselves. One by one, the photos grew clearer, each one a window into the abyss. The empty room, the flickering shadows, the twisted smile of the old man, each frame a testament to the nightmare that had become all too real. But it was the final image that stopped his heart, a picture of the child, standing in front of the open door, his eyes wide with terror. The door to the bathroom rattled, the sound of the old man's laughter filling the house. The shadows grew longer, reaching under the crack, their cold tendrils seeking him out. He knew he had to get the film out, had to show the world before it was too late. With shaking hands, he grabbed the developed pictures and stumbled into the hallway, the shadows closing in around him. The house was alive again, its malevolence a tangible presence that seemed to breathe down his neck. He could feel the old man's breath on his skin, the ghosts of the lost children tugging at his legs. But Mark didn't give in to fear. He knew what he had to do. He had to get out, had to tell the story of the house on the hill that had claimed so many. He raced down the stairs, the laughter growing louder, the shadows reaching for him. As he reached the front door, his hand on the knob, the house seemed to shudder, the walls groaning in protest. The door swung open, and the cold night air washed over him like a wave. He stumbled out into the street, the rain a cold embrace. He had survived, but he was not free. The camera's film was his proof, the images burned into his mind like a brand. He would not rest until the truth was told, until the house was no more. But as he looked back, the windows of the old man's house winked in the darkness, the shadows within seeming to mock his victory. The house was not done with him yet,